Tonight we stand on a hillside in the Paraíba Valley, just as the eastern sky begins to pale behind the coastal mountains, and you realize this is nothing like the coffee plantation you might imagine. The year is 1850, and you are a coffee farmer. Or rather, you are becoming one, because the land itself is still teaching you what that means. The air feels thick and heavy against your skin, carrying the sweet, slightly fermented scent of ripe coffee cherries from the slopes below, mixed with the damp breath of the forest that still crowds the ridges above your clearing. You wipe your forehead with the back of your hand, surprised at how early the humidity has already settled in, and you listen to the first sound of the fazenda waking up, the creak of ox-cart wheels, the distant call of an enslaved worker directing others toward the drying terraces, the rhythmic thump of coffee being pulped somewhere out of sight. You think about the letter you received last month from a cousin in Rio, full of promises about fortunes to be made here, about soil so rich it practically grows money, and you feel a brief flash of something between hope and dread. Because standing here, watching the mist rise off the valley, you also notice how the sky to the north has a strange yellowish tint, and the older workers are glancing at it with expressions you can't quite read. You probably won't survive this, at least not in the way you imagine. The valley has a way of eating people whole, spitting out their bones as coffee beans shipped to distant ports. But for now, you let yourself believe the morning is beautiful. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Now, dim the lights, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You've arrived in the Paraíba Valley during what historians would later call the first great coffee boom, when Brazil was transforming itself from a sleepy Portuguese colony into the world's coffee powerhouse, and you are part of that transformation whether you fully understand it or not. The valley stretches between Rio de Janeiro and São Paulo, a corridor of rolling hills that had once been covered in dense Atlantic forest, and now, in 1850, much of that forest has been burned to ash to make room for coffee trees in neat, regimented rows. You walk along the edge of one such planting, your boots sinking slightly into the red earth that everyone here calls terra roxa, purple soil, though it looks more like rust to you, and you notice how the coffee trees seem almost unnaturally uniform, each one pruned to about the same height, each branch heavy with cherries that range from green to yellow to deep crimson. The workers moving among them carry woven baskets strapped to their foreheads, their hands flying across the branches with a speed that seems impossible. And you realize you're staring because this is all new to you. The rhythm of harvest, the weight of the fruit, the way the whole valley seems to pulse with a single purpose. But your mind keeps drifting back to the sky, to that yellowish tinge, and to the conversation you had last night with your neighbor, a weathered man named Silveira who's been here since the first trees went in. He told you, in his gruff way, that the weather in this valley doesn't care about your plans, your dreams, or your debts. It does what it wants, and your job is simply to watch and react. You thought he was being dramatic, the way old farmers always are, but now, in the growing light, you're not so sure. The coffee tree itself is a demanding creature, you're learning, and it has opinions about the weather that you're only beginning to understand. Native to the highlands of Ethiopia, where it grew as an understory plant beneath taller forest canopy, Coffea arabica had been carried across continents and oceans over centuries, adapting to new climates but never quite forgetting its origins. It wants mild temperatures, you've been told, never too hot and never too cold, with a distinct dry season to trigger flowering and then reliable rains to swell the cherries to fullness. The Paraíba Valley, at least in theory, offered exactly that, a tropical highland climate with elevations between 500 and 1,000 meters, where the worst of the coastal heat was tempered by altitude, and where the seasonal rhythms of southeast Brazil aligned almost perfectly with the coffee's needs. Almost perfectly, you think, because nature never quite fits into human plans. The older workers, the ones who were born in Africa and brought here against their will, have their own ways of reading the sky and the wind, ways that don't appear in any agricultural manual you might have read back in Rio. They watch the behavior of birds, the direction of ant trails, the way certain leaves curl before rain, and they speak among themselves in languages you don't understand, exchanging observations that might mean the difference between a good harvest and disaster. You tell yourself you'll learn their methods eventually, that you'll become the kind of farmer who reads the land like a book, but for now you're still a stranger here, and the valley keeps its secrets close. As the sun finally crests the mountains and pours golden light across the hillsides, you see the full scale of what you've gotten yourself into. Your fazenda, and you still struggle to call it yours, even after signing all those papers, spreads across nearly 1,000 acres, with perhaps a third of that already planted in coffee, the rest still covered in the remnants of forest that will eventually be cleared and burned. The main house sits on a ridge above you, whitewashed walls and red tile roof still in shadow, while below it the slave quarters form a neat rectangle of low buildings, and beyond them the processing area with its massive stone patio where the coffee cherries will be spread to dry in the sun. You can hear the overseer's whistle now, sharp and insistent, calling the field workers to begin their day, and you watch as the baskets of freshly picked cherries begin moving toward the pulpers, machines that strip away the outer fruit to reveal the precious beans inside. The whole operation runs on a schedule dictated by weather, you realize, because coffee can't wait once it's ripe, and rain can ruin an entire harvest if it comes at the wrong moment. You think about your cousin's letter again, all those promises of easy wealth, and you wonder if he ever stood on a hillside like this, watching the sky and calculating his chances. Probably not, you decide. He was always more comfortable in the city, arranging deals and signing contracts, leaving the actual farming to people like you, the ones foolish enough to believe that land and rain and human labor could be reduced to numbers on a page. But you're here now, and the sky is clearing, and for this moment at least, the weather seems to be on your side. You find yourself spending more time with the old-timers than you ever expected, these weathered men who seem to carry the valley's history in their bones, and you begin to understand that their knowledge of weather runs far deeper than anything you could learn from a book. They call themselves caipiras, a word that city folks use with a smirk, but that here in the valley means something closer to people who belong to this place, and they've been watching Brazilian skies since long before coffee ever appeared on these hillsides. One of them, a man named Ze with skin like leather and eyes that seem to miss nothing, has taken to appearing beside you at odd moments, offering observations that sound like nonsense until you start noticing they're always right. He'll glance at the horizon, sniff the air, and mutter something about how the wind changed direction during the night, or how the clouds are stacking differently than they did yesterday, and then he'll go back to whatever he was doing, leaving you to wonder whether you just witnessed wisdom or superstition. But after a few weeks, you start noticing patterns yourself, the way certain cloud formations really do precede rain, the way the wind from the ocean feels different from the wind that comes down from the mountains, the way the temperature drops just before dawn in ways that matter for the coffee trees. Ze catches you watching the sky one morning and gives you a gap-toothed smile, the first real smile you've seen from him, and you realize you've passed some kind of test without even knowing it existed. The caipiras have names for weather phenomena that you've never heard anywhere else, a whole vocabulary that describes not just what the sky does but what it means for the land and the people living on it. There's the Veranico, for instance, a little summer that arrives in the middle of the rainy season, a stretch of clear skies and hot sun that can last anywhere from a few days to a couple of weeks, and that can either save a harvest or destroy it depending on exactly when it appears. You learn that the Veranico is both blessing and curse, because while it lets you dry coffee that might otherwise rot, it also stresses the trees at exactly the moment they need moisture to fill out their cherries, and getting the balance wrong means watching your crop shrink on the branch. Ze tells you about the year before you arrived, when a Veranico lasted nearly a month and the older coffee trees simply gave up, dropping their fruit before it was ripe, and the younger ones survived only because they hadn't yet developed deep enough roots to feel the full force of the drought. He tells these stories in a flat, matter-of-fact voice, as if describing something as ordinary as the sunrise, but you hear the weight behind them. The memory of seasons that went wrong, of harvests that failed, of families that packed up and left when the weather finally broke them. And you understand, slowly, that this knowledge isn't just folklore or tradition. It's survival information, hard-won through generations of watching and remembering, and it's worth more than all the agricultural manuals in Rio combined. The sky itself becomes a text you're learning to read, and you discover that every hour of daylight brings new clues if you know how to look. The color of the sunrise, for instance, if it's deep red and streaked with clouds, ZE says, you can expect wind within the day, while a pale yellow sky means the heat will build relentlessly until the afternoon, when thunderstorms might or might not appear. You test this against your own observations and find it holds up more often than not, though there are days when the sky lies, when everything looks perfect and then the rain comes anyway, or when the clouds pile up threateningly and then blow away without releasing a single drop. The enslaved workers have their own ways of reading weather, you notice, and sometimes their predictions conflict with what the Kaipiras say, creating a quiet competition of expertise that plays out in glances and muttered comments during the morning assembly. You learn that some of them come from regions in Africa with climates surprisingly similar to Brazil's, and they carry knowledge across the ocean that no European agricultural scientist ever documented. Knowledge about what certain winds mean, how animals behave before storms, which phases of the moon favor planting or harvesting. The overseer dismisses all of this as superstition, of course, insisting that only practical experience matters, but you've started keeping quiet about whose predictions you actually trust, because the truth is you'd rather be right than respectable. By the time the harvest season reaches its peak, you've developed your own habits of observation, standing at the same spot on the hillside every morning to watch the sky evolve from darkness to full light. You've learned that the valley has its own weather patterns, distinct from what happens even a few miles away, because the mountains channel winds in ways that create microclimates nobody bothers to map. Sometimes you can stand on your fazenda and watch rain falling on your neighbor's land while your own hillsides stay dry, the line between wet and sharp as a knife cut, and you've seen workers rush to move drying coffee just ahead of a storm that never actually arrives. The uncertainty wears on you, you realize, the constant calculation, the endless weighing of signs' importance, the knowledge that everything you've built depends on forces you can't control. But there's also something almost meditative about it, this daily practice of paying attention, of noticing what the world is doing and adjusting your expectations accordingly. ZE catches you at your spot one morning and stands beside you for a long moment, both of you watching the clouds catch fire in the rising sun, and then he nods once, sharply, and walks away without saying anything. You're not sure what the nod meant, but you choose to interpret it as approval, as a sign that maybe you're starting to belong here after all, even if belonging means accepting that you'll never fully understand the forces you're trying to navigate. You walk past the senzala just as the morning assembly is breaking up, and you pause for a moment to watch the enslaved workers heading toward the coffee fields, their movements efficient and wordless after years of practice. The quarters themselves are long, low buildings with packed earth floors and rough wooden walls, designed for nothing more than sleeping and shelter from the worst of the weather. And you notice how the morning sun falls across the doorways in patterns that must be as familiar to the residents as your own bedroom is to you. Some of the workers pause to glance at the sky before they move into the fields, and you wonder what they're seeing that you might miss. What memories of African skies, what generations of weather wisdom compressed into a single upward glance. The overseer shouts something about wasting time, and the moment passes, the workers fanning out among the coffee rows while you stand there feeling like an intruder on something you don't quite understand. But you can't stop thinking about those glances, about what it means to read weather when your life literally depends on getting it right, not just for harvest quality but for survival itself. For the enslaved men and women on your fazenda, weather means something fundamentally different than it means for you, and you're starting to grasp the shape of that difference even if you can never fully feel it yourself. When you worry about rain, you worry about crop yields and profit margins, about whether you'll meet your obligations to the coffee factors in Rio and whether the bank will extend your loans for another season. When they worry about rain, they worry about whether they'll be forced to work through the night to move drying coffee, whether the damp will seep through the thin walls of the senzala and leave them sleeping in wet clothing, whether the overseer's temper will worsen with the humidity and produce more frequent beatings. You've noticed that the worst weather days are also the days when punishments seem most common, as if the atmospheric pressure itself feeds human cruelty, And you've started watching the sky not just for agricultural reasons but for what it might predict about the mood descending on the fazenda. The older workers, the ones who've survived decades of this life, have learned to read those connections too. They know which kinds of weather bring out the worst in which overseers, which cloud formations mean extra work, which shifts in wind signal a rare moment when attention might be elsewhere and small freedoms become possible. The labor of coffee production is itself a conversation with weather, a constant negotiation between what needs to happen and what the sky will allow, and you watch the workers conduct this negotiation with their bodies every single day. When the cherries are ripe, they must be picked quickly, because overripe fruit ferments on the branch and ruins the flavor of the beans, but picking in the rain is nearly impossible. The cherries become slippery, the paths turn to mud, and the whole operation slows to a crawl while the crop deteriorates. So the workers learn to pick at double speed when clouds gather, to strip whole branches with movements that look reckless but are actually precisely calibrated to maximize speed without damaging the trees. You've seen women carry baskets on their heads through sudden downpours, their bodies angled against the wind, the baskets somehow staying dry under layers of cloth they've arranged with practiced skill. And you've seen the exhaustion at the end of such days, the way workers collapse onto the floor of the senzala without even the energy to eat, their hands still curved into the shape of coffee branches even in sleep. The weather writes itself onto their bodies in ways you'll never experience, in sore joints and scarred hands and memories of storms that become part of who they are. At night, when the work finally stops and the fazenda grows quiet, you sometimes walk near the senzala and hear sounds that you've learned to recognize as conversations about the day just past and the day to come. The workers speak in Portuguese when they know you're listening, but among themselves they slip into African languages, Kimbundu, Umbundu, Kikongo, and you catch fragments that you can't translate but that carry the emotional weight of weather talk anywhere in the world. There are tones of relief when the sky has cooperated, of worry when tomorrow looks uncertain, of dark humor about the absurdity of watching clouds when you can't do anything to change what they bring. You hear children's voices too, the ones born here in Brazil, and you realize they're learning weather wisdom in two languages at once, absorbing knowledge from their parents that will serve them whether they remain enslaved or somehow find freedom. Historians still argue whether the enslaved workers maintained distinct African weather traditions or whether those blended with indigenous and European knowledge to create something new. But standing here in the darkness, you don't need scholarship to tell you that these people understand the sky in ways you never will, because their survival has always depended on paying attention to things you were never forced to notice. You turn away from the senzala and walk back toward the big house, feeling the first cool breath of evening air on your skin, and you wonder what the night will bring, and more importantly, what they already know it will bring, long before you wake to find out. You stand in the middle of a coffee grove in early spring, and the silence feels wrong somehow, as if the whole hillside is holding its breath in anticipation of something you can't quite see. The trees stretch away from you in neat rows, their dark green leaves motionless in the still air, and you run your hand along a branch, feeling the tiny buds that have formed at each node. Hundreds of them, thousands, each one a potential flower that might or might not open depending on what the weather decides to do. This is the moment that every coffee farmer in the Paraíba Valley waits for, the hinge on which entire seasons turn, and there's nothing you can do now except watch the sky and hope. The buds need a specific signal to bloom, a trigger that exists somewhere in the complex interaction of temperature, rainfall, and day length. And until that signal comes, the whole fazenda exists in a kind of suspended animation, workers going through the motions of maintenance while everyone's thoughts drift toward the clouds. You've heard the older farmers talk about years when the flowers came early and the harvest was glorious, years when they came late and the crop was thin, years when they never really came at all and the valley seemed to shrink in on itself with disappointment. Now you're living through your first waiting season, and you're starting to understand why coffee farmers develop such intense relationships with weather. Because everything you've built, everything you've borrowed and invested and dreamed, is riding on what happens in the next few weeks. The flowering of coffee is one of the most spectacular events you've ever witnessed, when it finally happens, and you're not prepared for how it transforms the landscape almost overnight. You wake one morning to find the air thick with a sweet, jasmine-like fragrance that seems to come from everywhere at once, and you walk outside to discover that every coffee tree on the hillside has burst into white blossoms, so dense that from a distance the groves look like they've been dusted with snow. The flowers open in response to the first substantial rain after a dry period, a mechanism the coffee plant developed over millions of years to ensure that pollination happens when conditions are right for fruit development, and the synchrony is astonishing. Whole valleys turn white within days, as if some invisible conductor has given the signal to thousands of trees at once. You walk among them in a daze, brushing against branches that release puffs of pollen into the air, watching bees work frantically to gather nectar before the flowers fade. And you understand for the first time why poets write about coffee harvests even though they've never held a pruning hook. The beauty is real, undeniable, almost overwhelming, but underneath it you feel the anxiety that never quite leaves you now. The knowledge that this flowering is also a contract with the weather, a promise that the rains will continue steadily enough to swell the fertilized flowers into cherries, that no freak storm will strip the blossoms before they set fruit, that the delicate balance of sun and water will hold for months to come. For the next several weeks, you become obsessed with rain in a way that would have seemed pathological back in Rio, tracking every cloud, measuring every shower, comparing notes with neighboring farmers about what fell on their land versus yours. The newly formed fruits are tiny at first, green pinpricks at the center of each faded flower, and they need consistent moisture to grow. Not too much, because waterlogged roots invite disease, but never too little, because drought stress at this stage can cause the young fruits to abort entirely. You develop rituals without meaning to, checking the sky first thing every morning, running your fingers along branches to feel whether the soil moisture has reached the shallow roots, standing in the rain when it comes and trying to gauge whether it's falling hard enough to matter or just spitting theatrically before moving on. Ze watches you with amusement he doesn't bother to hide, and occasionally offers comments that sound like teasing but carry real information, pointing out that you're checking the wrong side of the trees for moisture, or that the rain you're so pleased about probably missed the upper slopes entirely. You take his corrections with what grace you can muster, because he's right and you know it, and because the stakes are too high for pride to matter. The growth of coffee cherries follows a rhythm that you learn to read in the changing colors and textures of the fruit, each stage marked by its own weather vulnerabilities and requirements. For the first few months, the cherries remain small and hard, green as the leaves around them, and your main concern is simply keeping the trees alive through the normal fluctuations of temperature and rainfall. But as the fruits approach maturity, they begin to swell and soften, changing first to yellow and then to the deep crimson that signals readiness for harvest, and this is when weather becomes truly terrifying. A heavy rain just before harvest can cause the cherries to absorb too much water and split open, ruining them for processing. A prolonged dry spell can stop development entirely, leaving you with undersized fruit that buyers will discount or reject. A hailstorm, though rare, can strip whole branches in minutes, littering the ground with unripe cherries that will rot where they fall. You learn to watch for the signs of each threat, to read the sky not just for what it's doing now but for what it might do next, and you develop a permanent crick in your neck from looking upward. The workers move through the groves with a different kind of attention, noticing things you'd never see. The way certain leaves curl before a dry spell, the behavior of insects that signals approaching rain, the subtle changes in bird calls that experienced ears interpret as weather forecasts. You try to learn from them without being obvious about it, picking up fragments of knowledge that you piece together into something like understanding, though you suspect you'll always be a student rather than a master of this particular art. The rain stops in January, and at first you barely notice because January is supposed to have rain. It's supposed to be the wettest month of the year when the coffee cherries are swelling toward harvest and everything green seems to be growing an inch a day. But the rain stops, and then it stays stopped, and by the third day you're standing in the yard watching clouds build over the mountains every afternoon only to dissipate before they reach your land, like promises that keep getting broken. Ze appears beside you without making a sound, the way he does, and you hear him mutter something under his breath that you don't quite catch, though the word Veronico comes through clearly enough. You've heard about this phenomenon, This little summer that inserts itself into the middle of the rainy season, but experiencing it is different from hearing about it. The way the air changes, the way the leaves on the coffee trees begin to droop slightly by midday, the way the whole valley seems to hold its breath waiting for something that might not come. The workers adjust their routines without being told, focusing on tasks that don't require moisture, repairing baskets and sharpening tools while they wait for the weather to remember what season it's supposed to be. You try to match their patience, but patience has never been your strong suit, and by the 5th day you're climbing to the highest point on your land every few hours just to scan the horizon for any sign of change. The Veronico reveals something about your coffee trees that you hadn't fully understood before, which is how differently they respond to stress depending on where they're planted and how old they are. The younger trees, the ones you put in just 2 years ago, show the effects first. Their leaves curl and their branches droop, and you find yourself walking among them with a watering can like a gardener tending vegetables. Even though you know it's absurd, that you can't water thousands of trees by hand, that the whole point of commercial farming is scale that makes such gestures meaningless. The older trees, the ones planted by the previous owner a decade ago, seem almost indifferent to the dry spell. Their deeper roots reaching moisture that the youngsters can't access, their leaves maintaining their usual gloss even as the days stretch on without rain. You start to understand why experienced farmers talk about coffee as a long-term investment, why they're willing to wait years for trees to mature, because resilience is something that develops slowly, that can't be rushed no matter how much money you throw at it. The trees that survive this Veronico will be stronger for it, Ze tells you one evening. Their root systems push deeper by necessity, their branches hardened by stress, but only if they survive, only if the dry spell doesn't last too long, only if the rain returns before permanent damage is done. By the 10th day, the valley has developed a kind of edgy quiet that you can feel in your bones, a tension that expresses itself in the way people talk to each other, in the sharpness of the overseer's commands, in the way even the animals seem to move more carefully than usual. The coffee cherries have stopped growing. You can tell, their development arrested by the lack of moisture, and you calculate backward from harvest to figure out what this means for your schedule, for your contracts, for the loans that are due whether the coffee sells or not. The numbers don't look good, and you find yourself doing the math over and over as if repetition might somehow change the outcome, as if wishing hard enough could make the rain return. You hear stories from neighboring fazendas about what happened in previous Veranicos. The year when the dry spell lasted 6 weeks and half the crop failed. The year when it broke just in time and produced the best harvest in memory. The year when it ended with hailstorms that damaged what the drought had spared. Historians still argue whether the Veronico is a predictable climate pattern or simply weather doing what weather does. But standing here in the middle of one, you don't care about scholarly debates. You care about the sky, about the clouds that build and fade, about the rain that won't come. Then, on the 14th day, everything changes. You wake to a different kind of light, a grayness that presses against the windows instead of the harsh brightness of the previous weeks, and you're out of bed and outside before you're fully awake, tilting your face toward a sky that finally looks serious about delivering. The clouds are low and dark, moving fast, and you can smell the rain before it arrives. That particular scent of dust and ozone and wet earth that your brain has learned to treat as the most important signal in the world. The workers are already moving, you notice, spreading out across the fazenda to secure loose objects and clear drainage channels, and you join them without thinking about it. Suddenly part of a collective purpose that transcends the usual divisions of this place. When the first drops fall, fat and heavy, you feel tears prick at your own eyes and you're not entirely sure whether they're from relief or from the dust that the rain is washing out of the air. The Veronico is over, and your trees have survived. And for this moment at least, the weather has decided to let you continue your precarious existence as a coffee farmer in a valley that doesn't care whether you succeed or fail. You've heard whispers about the frost since you arrived in the valley, warnings that you dismissed as the kind of tall tales old farmers tell to scare newcomers. Stories about years when the south wind carried death on its breath and the coffee trees turned black overnight. Brazil is tropical, you told yourself, and frost is something that happens in Europe or North America, in places where winter means something real, not here in the land of perpetual summer. But now it's July of 1855, and you're standing in your fields at dawn, and everything you believed about your adopted home is being rewritten by what you see around you. The air has a sharpness you've never felt before, a bite that penetrates your clothing and settles in your bones, and the coffee trees that should be dark green are instead covered in a white crust that sparkles in the first light like something beautiful and terrible at once. You reach out to touch a leaf and it crumbles at your fingertips, the tissue destroyed by cold that the plant was never designed to withstand, and you hear yourself make a sound that you don't recognize, something between a moan and a curse. Behind you, the slaves have gathered in silence, their faces expressionless in a way that tells you they've seen this before, that they know what comes next even if you're still struggling to understand. The frost of 1855 doesn't just damage your crop, it annihilates it, and it takes you weeks to fully grasp the scale of what has happened because your brain keeps trying to find exceptions, to locate pockets of survival that might salvage something from the disaster. You walk the fazenda methodically, section by section, and everywhere you find the same scene. Leaves blackened and falling, branches brittle as old bones, the delicate structure of next year's flower buds destroyed before they ever had a chance to form. The older trees, the ones that survived previous frosts, show signs of resprouting from the roots, but the younger ones are simply gone, their above-ground growth killed outright, and you calculate that you've lost not just this year's harvest but the next 2 or 3 as well. The slaves begin the work of clearing the dead wood without waiting for instructions, because there's always work to do even when the work is burying the evidence of your failure, and you watch them from the hillside where you've stood so many mornings reading the sky. The sky today is innocent, clear and blue and utterly indifferent to what it did to you last night, and you feel a surge of rage at its placid beauty that surprises you with its intensity. You want to shake your fist at the clouds, to demand an explanation, to make the weather answer for what it's taken from you. But the weather doesn't answer questions, doesn't acknowledge your existence, doesn't care that you're standing here with your life's work reduced to kindling. The economic impact of the great frost ripples outward from your fazenda like waves from a stone dropped in still water, and you watch your neighbors pack up and leave one by one, their dreams of coffee fortune replaced by the practical necessity of survival. The ones who can afford to wait, who have reserves of capital or credit deep enough to weather multiple lost seasons, stay and begin the slow process of replanting. But most can't. Most borrowed too much, bet too heavily, trusted too completely in a valley that has just demonstrated its capacity for betrayal. You lie awake at night doing calculations that always end the same way, with numbers that don't add up and futures that don't exist, and you find yourself envying the slaves in a way that shames you because at least they don't have to pretend they chose this life. They move through the ruined fields with a kind of grim acceptance, doing what needs to be done without complaint because complaint has never changed anything for people like them. And you wonder what they think of you now, this planter who stood so confidently on his hillside reading clouds while the real danger was something he couldn't see coming. But something unexpected happens in the months after the frost, something that changes your understanding of both coffee and the people who grow it. The slaves, drawing on knowledge they brought from Africa or learned from elders who survived previous disasters, begin showing you how to prune the damaged trees in ways that encourage recovery, how to identify which roots will send up new shoots and which are truly dead, how to manage the soil to protect the survivors from further stress. You learn that coffee is more resilient than you realized, that the plant evolved in environments where frost was rare but not impossible, and that its survival strategy involves sacrificing above-ground growth to protect the root system that will regenerate when conditions improve. You also learn that some of the slaves remember frosts from their own childhoods in Africa, highland regions where temperatures dropped in ways that European geographers never documented, and that their knowledge of cold weather survival comes from traditions as old as the coffee plant itself. The collaboration is awkward, uncomfortable, weighted by the power dynamics that define every interaction on this fazenda, but it's also real. You're learning from people you own, and the contradiction sits heavily on you even as you apply their lessons to saving your livelihood. By the time the first new shoots appear, pale green against the blackened stumps, you've started to see your slaves differently, and yourself differently too, though you're not yet sure what either of those changes will mean. The rains fail in 1857, and then they fail again in 1858. And by the third year you've stopped expecting anything different when you wake to another cloudless dawn. The Paraíba Valley has transformed into something you barely recognize. The hills that were once lush green fading to brown and then to the gray of dead vegetation. The streams that ran year-round reduced to trickles and then to dry beds where cattle low piteously at the memory of water. You walk through your coffee groves and feel the crunch of dry leaves underfoot. Hear the rasp of wind through branches that should be heavy with cherries but instead carry nothing. And you understand that you're witnessing something beyond the normal fluctuations of weather. Something that might be permanent or might be temporary, but that feels, in this moment, like the end of the world you thought you were building. The slaves have developed a different rhythm now, conserving energy during the heat of the day, working in the early mornings and late evenings when the sun's intensity eases slightly. And you've learned to do the same because the alternative is collapse before noon. Water has become the most precious substance on the fazenda, more valuable than coffee, more valuable than the labor that goes into producing it, and you find yourself calculating every drop, measuring every source, policing usage in ways that feel degrading but necessary. The drought reveals hierarchies you hadn't fully acknowledged before, pecking orders of access to water that play out in who drinks first at the well, whose animals get the last of the stored rainwater, whose laundry is done and whose isn't. The big house has its own cistern, of course, built by the previous owner to ensure that the family never went thirsty even in the worst conditions. And you tell yourself this is reasonable, necessary, that the slaves have the stream even if it's low, that the animals can be walked to the river if they have to. But you also notice that the overseer's family seems to have more water than they need, that the cook's children are always sent to the back of the line at the well, that the African-born slaves look at the cistern with expressions you don't want to interpret too closely. The weather has forced choices on you that you never expected to make, moral calculations disguised as practical decisions, and you're not sure you like the person you're becoming as you make them. At night, lying awake in the heat, you think about the letter from your cousin that started all this, the promises of easy wealth in a valley where rain was supposed to be reliable, and you wonder if he ever imagined this version of Brazil, dusty and desperate, with farmers fighting over streams and slaves watching their children weaken from thirst. The coffee trees themselves become teachers during these years, demonstrating survival strategies that you'd never noticed when water was abundant. Some shed leaves to reduce moisture loss, standing bare branch like deciduous trees in winter even though the calendar says summer. Others produce smaller, more concentrated cherries that ripen earlier, as if the plant knows it might not have enough water to sustain a full crop. You learn to identify which varieties handle drought best, which slopes retain moisture longest, which soil types give the roots enough purchase to reach deep water tables. The knowledge comes too late to save the crops you've already lost, but you file it away for the future, for the rains that must eventually return, for the next time the weather decides to test you. Ze, who has seen droughts before, tells you stories of years when the valley almost emptied of people, when families loaded their remaining possessions onto carts and headed for the coast or the cities, when the ones who stayed survived only because they knew secrets that the newcomers hadn't learned. He doesn't say whether you're one of the ones who will stay or go, but you see the question in his eyes when he thinks you're not looking, and you don't have an answer for him because you don't have an answer for yourself. The social fabric of the valley frays during the drought years, connections between neighbors growing strained as competition for resources intensifies, and the old networks of mutual aid prove inadequate to the scale of the crisis. You hear stories of fazendas where slaves were sold off because the owners couldn't feed them, of families that split up to increase their chances of survival, of disputes over water rights that escalated into violence. Your own relationships with neighboring farmers grow more distant, partly because there's less to share and partly because everyone is focused inward, trying to hold together what remains of their lives. The coffee factors in Rio send letters expressing sympathy but also demanding payment, and you write back promising harvests that may never come, promises that feel like lies even as you write them. The only people who seem unchanged by the drought are the African-born slaves, the ones who remember landscapes even harsher than this one, who carry within the memories of famines and migrations that make Brazil's troubles seem almost manageable. You watch them move through the dusty fields with a calm that you can't understand, and you wonder what they know that you don't, what histories of survival have shaped them into people who can face this without the despair that grips you every time you look at the sky. When the rains finally return, they don't return gently. They crash into the valley like an invading army, turning 3 years of accumulated dust into mud so deep that ox carts sink to their axles and men lose their boots trying to walk from one building to another. You stand on the veranda of the big house and watch water sheet off the roof in curtains, watch the yard transform into a lake, watch the coffee trees bend under the weight of droplets that seem determined to make up for lost time all at once. The first day is celebration, slaves and free workers alike running out to let the rain soak their clothes, tilting faces upward to catch the sweetness on their tongues, laughing in a way you haven't heard in years. By the third day, the laughter has stopped, replaced by the grim realization that too much rain can be as destructive as too little, that the moisture you prayed for is now threatening to rot your crop from the inside out. The cherries that managed to form during the drought's final months are swelling too fast, splitting open in some cases, and the ones that aren't splitting are developing fungal spots that spread like wildfire in the humid air. You find yourself praying for the rain to stop now, which feels obscene after 3 years of praying for it to start. But farming has never been about consistency. It's about wanting whatever you don't have, whenever you don't have it. The slaves work through the downpours because the coffee won't wait, because every hour of rain means more damage to the crop, because the overseer's whip doesn't care about weather. You watch them from the veranda sometimes, feeling guilty for staying dry, and other times you join them in the fields because the guilt is worse than the discomfort. The mud sucks at your boots with every step, makes simple movements into exhausting struggles, and you marvel at the workers who've learned to move through it efficiently, their bodies adapted to conditions that still defeat you. The coffee they bring in from the fields is wetter than it should be, heavy with absorbed moisture, and the drying process that normally takes days now stretches into weeks because there's no sun to complete it. You build fires under the drying patios, experimental structures that you've heard about but never tried, and you learn that drying coffee with smoke imparts flavors that buyers will notice and discount, that there's no good substitute for sun no matter how clever your adaptations. The slaves who tend these fires develop coughs that linger, respiratory problems that will probably shorten their lives, but you tell yourself there's no choice, that the alternative is losing the entire harvest, that in the calculus of survival some sacrifices are unavoidable. The valley itself seems to rot during these weeks, the constant moisture bringing out smells you never noticed before, the sweet decay of overripe fruit, the fungal must of wet wood, the particular odor of standing water that breeds mosquitoes and disease. Fever runs through the slave quarters, then through the free workers' families, then through the big house itself, and you spend days shaking with chills that no blanket can warm while listening to the endless percussion of rain on the roof. The doctor who visits when you're well enough to send for him charges prices that make you wince and offers treatments that seem designed more to extract money than to cure disease. Bleeding, purging, mysterious powders of uncertain origin. The slaves have their own remedies, herbal preparations that some of them brought from Africa and others learned from indigenous peoples. And you notice that the ones who use these treatments recover faster than the ones who trust the doctor's expensive interventions. You file this observation away with all the others, building a catalogue of weather knowledge that includes not just how to read the sky but how to survive what the sky delivers. By the time the rain's finally moderate, settling into something closer to normal, you've lost perhaps a third of your harvest to rot and another quarter to the quality degradation caused by smoke drying and delayed processing. The numbers are better than they could have been, worse than you'd hoped, somewhere in the grey zone that coffee farmers learn to inhabit. Not quite disaster, not quite success, just another season survived in a business where survival is the only consistent measure of achievement. The slaves who made it through the fevers return to the fields with the same steady movements they've always had, their bodies carrying memories of this season that will inform their work in seasons to come. You return to your spot on the hillside, the one you've stood on so many mornings, and you watch the sky with eyes that have learned new things about what clouds can bring. The valley is green again, lush almost to the point of absurdity, and you find yourself missing the stark beauty of the drought years in a way that makes no sense but feels real nonetheless. The weather gives and takes and gives again, and your job is simply to be here when it does, to receive whatever it sends and turn it into coffee, into survival, into another year of life in this place that has become your home whether you intended it or not. You receive an invitation in the spring of 1862 that you initially mistake for a social call. Some neighbors attempt at festivity after years when nobody felt like celebrating. But the handwriting on the envelope is formal in a way that suggests something more than polite society. The invitation comes from the Bararo de Vasuras, one of the wealthiest coffee barons in the valley, a man whose name carries weight in Rio and Lisbon and even in the coffee exchanges of Europe, and you arrive at his fazenda with a mixture of curiosity and apprehension that only grows when you see the other guests. They're the major planters of the region, the ones who survived the frost and the drought and the rot, the ones whose credit lines remain open when smaller farmers like yourself are being politely asked to settle accounts. The Bararo greets you at the door with a formality that suggests he knows exactly who you are and exactly how much you owe, and then he leads you to a salon where a strange piece of equipment sits on the table. A glass tube filled with silvery liquid, mounted on a wooden board marked with numbers you don't recognize. The barometer, the Bararo explains, is the future of coffee farming, a scientific instrument that will free planters from the superstitions of slaves and the folk wisdom of caipiras, replacing guesswork with measurement and tradition with progress. You listen to him describe how this device measures the weight of the air, how changes in that weight predict changes in weather with a reliability that no human observation can match, and you feel your certainties shifting in ways you don't quite welcome. The old ways, the ways of watching clouds and smelling wind and reading animal behavior, have kept you alive through years that killed other planters, and you're not ready to dismiss them as superstition just because some baron bought a fancy toy from Europe. But you also can't deny the logic of measurement, the appeal of numbers that don't lie, the promise of a future where weather becomes predictable rather than merely survivable. The other planters ask questions about cost and reliability, about where to buy such instruments and how to interpret their readings, and you find yourself staying silent, watching, trying to decide whether this glass tube represents salvation or another kind of trap. The Bararo's enthusiasm for scientific weather prediction reflects a broader shift in Brazilian coffee culture. You learn over the following months, as European ideas about agriculture begin penetrating the valley alongside European capital and European tastes. Agricultural manuals appear in the hands of planters who previously relied on oral tradition, their pages filled with tables of optimal temperatures and rainfall amounts, with diagrams of proper tree spacing and pruning techniques, with confident assertions about how nature should behave if only farmers would follow proper methods. You acquire some of these manuals yourself, partly out of curiosity and partly because your creditors seem impressed when you mention them, and you spend evenings trying to reconcile their prescriptions with what you've learned from ZE and the slaves and your own scarred experience. The manuals tell you that coffee needs specific conditions, that deviations from these conditions indicate poor management rather than weather's inherent unpredictability, that scientific farming can overcome the vagaries of climate through proper technique. You want to believe this, need to believe it, because the alternative is accepting that you're at the mercy of forces you'll never fully understand. But the barometer on your wall, when you finally acquire one, tells a more complicated story than the manuals suggest. You watch it rise and fall with weather patterns, learning to read its language, and you discover that it confirms some of what the caipiras taught you while contradicting other parts. Low pressure really does precede storms, just as ZE's aching joints always predicted. Rapid drops really do signal the kind of extreme events that the old-timers read in bird behavior and cloud formations. But the barometer can't tell you whether the rain will last an hour or a week, whether it will fall gently or in destructive torrents, whether the cold front it signals will bring a killing frost or just a crisp morning. The instrument gives you data, but data isn't wisdom, and you find yourself still watching the sky every morning, still noticing how the wind feels on your skin, still paying attention to the slaves' murmured observations about what the animals are doing. The Bararo might believe that science will replace tradition, but you're learning that they work better together, that measurement and experience are partners rather than competitors in the endless negotiation with weather. The railroad reaches your part of the valley in 1864, and suddenly the weather matters in ways it never did before, because now your coffee has a schedule to keep. You stand at the new station on its opening day, watching the locomotive belch smoke against a sky that threatens rain, and you feel the shift in your bones. The way time has compressed, the way distance has shrunk, the way your relationship with weather has become entangled with arrival and departure times printed on sheets of paper in Rio. Before the railroad, coffee moved by mule train to the ports, a journey that took weeks and accommodated itself to weather almost organically. If rains made the trails impassable, the mules waited, and if rivers flooded, the coffee waited with them, and nobody complained because nobody expected anything different. But the railroad runs on schedules, and the schedules assume that coffee will be ready when the cars arrive, that the weather will cooperate with the printing presses that produce timetables months in advance. You watch the station master consult his barometer with an intensity that rivals your own, and you realize that he's now as invested in your weather as you are, that his job depends on predicting what the sky will do so that the trains can run on time. The new calculus of weather and transportation changes how you manage your harvest, introducing pressures you never anticipated when you first stood on this hillside dreaming of coffee fortunes. Now you must coordinate picking with train schedules, must have the beans dried and bagged by specific dates or watch them sit at the station while the cars depart without them, must calculate not just when the coffee is ready but when the railroad says it can be moved. The slaves feel these pressures too, though differently. They work longer hours when trains are coming, push through weather that might have paused harvest in earlier years, sacrifice quality for speed when the alternative is missing the connection that gets the coffee to Rio before prices drop. You watch them move through the fields with a new kind of urgency, and you wonder what they think of this iron monster that now dictates the rhythm of their labor, that turns weather from a natural force into a logistical problem. The older ones, the ones who remember Africa, sometimes pause in their work to watch the trains pass, their expressions unreadable, and you don't ask what they're thinking because you're not sure you want to know. The railroad also brings weather news, a development whose significance takes you a while to fully grasp. Before the Iron Horse, you knew what was happening in your valley and maybe in the neighboring ones, but beyond that the world was rumor and guesswork, stories carried by travelers that might be weeks old by the time they reached you. Now the trains bring newspapers from Rio, letters from the coffee factors, reports on weather in other growing regions that suddenly matters because it affects prices and demand and the complex equations of supply that determine whether your harvest will fetch a fortune or barely cover costs. You learn that weather is not just local but regional, national, even international. That droughts in other parts of Brazil affect what buyers will pay for your coffee, that frosts in Sao Paulo create opportunities for you, that the same global systems that send rain or sun to your valley are simultaneously shaping conditions everywhere else. The knowledge is empowering and unsettling at once, expanding your world even as it reminds you how small you are within it. The station becomes a gathering place for planters on days when trains are due, a kind of informal exchange where weather information is traded alongside coffee samples and gossip about whose crops are thriving and whose are failing. You stand with your neighbors watching the sky and the tracks, comparing barometer readings and predictions, arguing about whether the clouds building to the south will bring rain before the afternoon train arrives. The railroad has made you all weather watchers in a new way, has transformed what was once private knowledge into public currency, has created a community of observers linked not by blood or friendship but by shared dependence on schedules written in distant offices. You find yourself developing rivalries with planters whose land lies closer to the station, whose coffee reaches the cars before yours when rains delay the harvest, and alliances with those whose harvest windows align with your own. The weather has always shaped relationships in the valley, but now it does so with a precision that feels modern, almost industrial, as if the locomotive's timetable has imposed order on forces that were once content to remain chaotic. You notice the change in the air before you understand what it means, a tension that has nothing to do with barometric pressure or wind direction but that feels as real as any weather you've ever tried to read. The year is 1871, and the law of free birth has just passed in Rio, declaring that children born to enslaved women from this moment forward will be free, not immediately free, not free in any way that changes their daily lives, but free in theory, free in a future that may or may not arrive. The slaves on your fazenda receive the news in silence, their faces revealing nothing, and you find yourself watching them with a new kind of attention, trying to read what this change means for the weather of your shared existence. The older ones, the ones born in Africa, seem most affected. Their eyes holding something that might be hope or might be grief or might be simply the recognition that the world is shifting in ways they never expected to see. The younger ones, the ones who have known only Brazil, only this valley, only your fazenda, seem almost indifferent, and you wonder whether this means they've accepted their condition or whether they're simply better at hiding what they feel. The weather of the 1870s seems to reflect the political climate, or maybe you're just projecting, seeing in storms and droughts the same uncertainty that grips the valley as abolition moves from impossible dream to inevitable reality. The seasons themselves feel off, unpredictable in new ways. Rains that come too early or too late, temperatures that spike and plunge without warning, storms that seem to carry a personal animosity toward whoever happens to be in their path. You consult your barometer obsessively, as if more data might somehow make sense of a world that has stopped making sense, but the numbers tell you nothing about the questions that really matter. How do you plan for a future when the labor system that built your wealth is crumbling? How do you read the sky when the ground beneath you is shifting? The slaves go about their work with the same efficiency they've always shown, but you notice them talking among themselves more often, gathering in small groups after the overseer has passed, exchanging looks that carry meanings you can't decipher. The abolitionist movement in the cities sends ripples through the valley that feel like weather fronts, invisible but powerful, changing the atmosphere in ways that affect everyone whether they acknowledge it or not. You hear stories of fazendas where slaves have simply walked away, where the old relationships of power have dissolved overnight, where planters who thought they understood their workers wake to find themselves alone with their coffee trees and their questions. Your own slaves stay, for now, but you catch yourself watching them with a new kind of attention, noticing small acts of resistance you might have missed before. The extra moment of rest, the tool left just out of place, the glance that holds your eyes a beat too long. The weather of human relations is shifting, and you're no better at predicting it than you are at predicting the sky, despite all your years of practice at both. The law of free birth creates a strange new category of person on your fazenda, children who are legally free but practically enslaved, who will grow up alongside children who remain property until some future date that nobody can specify. You watch these children play together, unable to tell which ones are which, and you wonder what they'll become, what world they'll inherit, whether the weather of their lives will be kinder than the weather you've navigated. The older slaves take special interest in these freeborn children, teaching them things you never see taught to the others. Songs in African languages, stories about places across the ocean, skills that might serve them in a future where they can actually choose their paths. You pretend not to notice these lessons, telling yourself that what happens in the slave quarters after dark is none of your business, but you know you're avoiding a confrontation you're not ready to have. The abolitionist clouds are gathering, and you can feel the pressure dropping, can sense the storm that's coming, but you don't know when it will break or what it will leave behind when it passes. The mid-1870s bring a stretch of weather so consistently favorable that you almost forget to be anxious, almost stop checking the sky every morning, almost relax into the comfortable rhythm of harvests that arrive on time and coffee that dries perfectly and prices that seem to rise with each shipment to Rio. You know better than to trust this, know that weather is never permanently kind, that the valley always collects its debts eventually, but you can't help letting your guard down just a little, can't help enjoying the sensation of success after so many years of mere survival. The coffee trees respond to the benevolent conditions with a productivity you've never seen, their branches bending under the weight of cherries so abundant that the slaves can barely keep up with picking, their beans developing flavors that buyers compete to purchase at premium prices. You walk through the groves on golden afternoons and feel something you haven't felt since your first year here, that giddy sense of possibility, that belief that maybe you really will make the fortune your cousin promised so long ago. The weather during these years seems almost designed to maximize coffee quality, each season bringing exactly what the trees need at exactly the right moment. The dry winters trigger uniform flowering, the springs bring gentle rains that swell the young fruits without damaging them, the summers offer just enough heat to develop complex flavors without stressing the plants. The harvest seasons arrive with weeks of cloudless skies that let you dry the beans to perfection. You find yourself almost bored by the predictability, catching yourself wishing for a little drama, a little challenge, something to prove that your skills are still sharp. The slaves notice your restlessness and exchange amused glances that you pretend not to see, because you know how ridiculous you must look. A farmer complaining about perfect weather, a planter nostalgic for the crises that nearly destroyed him. But there's truth in your restlessness too, a recognition that farming without struggle is somehow less satisfying, that the victories that cost nothing are the ones you value least. The money flows in during these years, more than you ever imagined, filling coffers that had been dangerously empty and allowing luxuries you'd only dreamed of. You improve the big house, add rooms for your growing family, purchase furniture from Rio that makes your old possessions look shabby by comparison. You invest in new equipment, more efficient processing machinery that reduces the labor needed for each stage of production, and you tell yourself this is progress, this is the future, this is what all those years of struggle were supposed to lead to. The slaves work with the new machines, learning their rhythms and quirks, and you notice that the work seems less brutal now, that the overseer's whip is used less frequently, that something like contentment sometimes flickers across faces that you've only ever seen as stoic. You want to believe this is permanent, that the good weather and good prices and good fortune will last forever, but somewhere underneath the satisfaction you feel the old anxiety waiting, the knowledge that none of this is guaranteed, that the valley has its own plans. The paradox of these golden years is that they make you more anxious about weather, not less, because now you have so much more to lose. When you were barely surviving, a bad harvest meant going without luxuries you'd never had. Now a bad harvest could mean losing everything you've built, watching the improvements crumble, returning to the desperate calculations of your early years. You check the barometer obsessively, study the sky with an attention that borders on pathological, question the slaves about their observations with an intensity that makes them uncomfortable. They tell you what they see, but you can tell they're holding back, protecting you from predictions that might disturb your peace, and you're not sure whether to thank them or demand the truth they're hiding. The weather stays beautiful, stays cooperative, stays almost insultingly perfect, and you wait for the other shoe to drop with a tension that no amount of success can ease. The golden years are wonderful, but they're also exhausting, because you know they can't last, because nothing in this valley ever does. The first signs of trouble are subtle, easy to dismiss as normal variation, the kind of small disappointments that every farmer learns to accept as part of the bargain with nature. A few trees here and there produce fewer cherries than they should, a hillside that once yielded bountiful harvests now seems tired, the soil that was always so responsive to rain now seems to shed water rather than absorbing it. You tell yourself it's nothing, that next year will be better, that the weather will cooperate and the trees will recover and everything will return to the way it was during the golden years. But the slaves know better. You can tell from the way they look at the land, from the conversations that stop when you approach, from the small adjustments they make to planting and pruning that acknowledge realities you're not ready to face. The land is tired, they're trying to tell you, and weather alone can't fix what time and exploitation have done. The coffee tree, you're learning, is not designed for the treatment you've been giving it, decades of continuous production without rest, without the fallow periods that occur in nature, without the diversity of species that would protect the soil from exhaustion. The weather still does its part, bringing rain and sun in the usual patterns, but the land can no longer respond as it once did, can no longer transform those gifts into abundant harvests. You watch your yields decline year by year, a slow erosion that feels like death by 1,000 cuts, and you try everything you can think of to reverse it. New pruning techniques, different spacing between trees, experiments with fertilizer that you import at great expense from Europe. Nothing works, or nothing works well enough. and you begin to understand that you're witnessing something larger than weather, something that all your sky watching and barometer reading can't address. The land itself is changing, and the weather is just the messenger delivering the news. The valley as a whole seems to be aging. You notice when you ride through it, the fazendas that once gleamed white in the sun now showing patches of peeling paint, the coffee groves that stretched unbroken now interrupted by patches of scrub and erosion. Some of your neighbors have given up, sold out to larger planters, or simply walked away, leaving their land to whoever might claim it. The ones who remain are fighting the same battle you're fighting, watching their yields decline, trying new methods that rarely work, hoping for weather miracles that never quite arrive. The slaves watch this decline with expressions you can't read, and you wonder what they think of this slow unraveling, whether they see it as justice or tragedy or simply the way of all human enterprises. They keep working, keep doing what they've always done, but you notice that some of the younger ones have started looking toward the cities, toward futures that don't include coffee or this valley or you. The weather itself seems to participate in the decline, bringing harsher droughts and more destructive storms than you remember from your early years, as if the atmosphere has joined the conspiracy against your success. You can't tell whether the climate is actually changing or whether you're just more vulnerable now, whether the same weather that you weathered in the 1850s would destroy you today because your land has lost its resilience. Historians still argue whether the Paraíba Valley experienced genuine climate shifts during this period or whether the perception of change reflects soil exhaustion and economic pressure rather than meteorological reality. Standing here watching your coffee trees struggle, you don't care about the academic debate. You care about whether the rain will come, whether the yields will recover, whether you can hold on long enough to pass something to your children besides debt and disappointment. The land is tired, the weather is unpredictable, and you're tired too, tired of watching skies that no longer bring the news you want to hear. The year 1888 arrives with weather that feels almost mocking in its perfection, clear skies, and gentle rains and temperatures that seem designed to produce the finest coffee the valley has ever seen. You stand on your hillside in the early mornings, watching the cherries ripen to deep crimson against dark green leaves, and you feel the weight of irony pressing down on everything you see. The abolition law came in May, while the harvest was just beginning, and suddenly the workers who have picked your coffee for decades were free to walk away, and many of them did, disappearing into a future that you can't imagine any more than they can. The ones who stayed are here by choice now, working for wages that you negotiate each morning, and the whole rhythm of the fazenda has changed in ways you're still struggling to understand. The coffee doesn't care about any of this, of course. It ripens on schedule, indifferent to the social revolution unfolding around it, demanding to be picked whether the pickers are enslaved or free. You watch the free workers move through the groves with a new kind of attention, noticing how their movements have changed now that the overseer's whip is just a memory. They work more slowly, more deliberately, pausing when they need to rest, stopping to talk with each other in ways that would have drawn punishment just months ago. The harvest proceeds anyway, because there are enough of them and the weather is cooperating, but you calculate the difference in productivity and feel the old anxiety stirring. How do you manage a workforce that can simply leave if they don't like your terms? How do you plan for a future when the people who make your plans possible have their own plans, their own dreams, their own ideas about what comes next? The weather gives you no answers, just continues its perfect procession of sun and gentle rain, as if to remind you that nature's indifference is the only constant in all of this. The free workers have names now, names you never learned when they were property, and you find yourself using them awkwardly, stumbling over syllables that should be familiar but feel strange in your mouth. João, who was always the best pruner, shows you techniques he learned from his father that you never knew existed. Maria, whose mother tended the drying patios for 40 years, explains why the coffee needs more time this season despite the perfect weather. They talk to you differently now, with a directness that would have been unthinkable before, and you realize how much you never knew about the people who made your life possible. The weather continues its benevolent course, almost as if it's giving you space to learn these new relationships, to adjust to a world where the old certainties have dissolved and nothing has yet taken their place. The last harvest of the slave era becomes the first harvest of something else, and you move through it in a daze of mixed emotions. Grief for the world that's ended, relief that you no longer have to be its enforcer, fear of the future, gratitude for the weather that's making this transition as gentle as possible. The coffee comes in steadily, the drying patios fill with beans that gleam in the sun, the bags stack up in the warehouse awaiting transport to the railroad. You sign pay envelopes at the end of each week, watching free workers count their wages with expressions you can't quite read, and you wonder what they're thinking, what they're planning, whether they'll be here next week or next year or whenever the next harvest comes around. The sky stays clear, almost absurdly clear, as if the weather itself is trying to tell you something about endings and beginnings, about the way life continues even when everything changes. You stand on your hillside for the last time in the early 1890s, watching a sunrise that looks exactly like the one you saw on your first morning here, and you try to feel something appropriate to the moment, sadness, maybe, or triumph, or at least a clean sense of closure. Instead you feel mostly tired, and a little surprised that you've lasted this long, that you're still standing after everything the valley has thrown at you. The fazenda below you is quiet now, most of its coffee trees replaced by cattle pasture, its buildings empty except for the few free workers who stay on to tend the herds. You've sold most of the land to a larger company, one of those new enterprises that seem to think beef is the future, and you've kept only a small plot for yourself, a place to retire to when you finally leave the valley for good. The weather this morning is beautiful, of course, because the weather has always been beautiful on mornings when you least needed it to be, and you find yourself laughing at the irony, at the way this place has taught you to expect nothing and appreciate everything. The lessons the weather taught you, you realize, have almost nothing to do with the practical knowledge you thought you were accumulating all these years. Yes, you learned to read clouds and understand barometers, to predict when to plant and when to harvest, to recognize the signs of frost and drought and rot before they destroyed your crops. But those were just techniques, tools for survival, and survival was never really the point. What the weather taught you, what it took you 40 years to understand, was that you were never in control. Not of the sky, not of the land, not of the people who worked for you, not even of yourself. You arrived here believing that a man with enough capital and enough determination could bend the world to his will, and the valley spent decades proving you wrong, patiently and repeatedly, until the lesson finally sank in. The weather does what it does, and you do what you can, and sometimes those two things align well enough to produce coffee, and sometimes they don't. And either way the sun keeps rising and the seasons keep turning and the world goes on without you. The people who shared these years with you have scattered like seeds in wind, and you think about them now as the sun climbs higher over the valley. Ze died years ago, in his sleep, as if the valley finally decided he'd earned a peaceful exit. The slaves who became free workers, who became something like friends in the strange aftermath of abolition, have mostly moved on to cities or other regions, chasing opportunities that don't exist here anymore. Some of them write letters occasionally, letters that arrive with the irregularity of weather itself, telling you about lives you can barely imagine in places you've never seen. You write back when you can, trying to convey something of what you feel, though you're never sure the words come out right. The valley holds all their histories now, all the years of labor and hope and disappointment, all the weather that shaped them into the people they became. You turn away from the hillside and begin the walk back to the house, your steps slower than they used to be, your eyes still automatically scanning the sky out of habit. The clouds building to the north might bring rain by afternoon, or they might not, and for the first time in 40 years it doesn't matter to you which way they decide. Someone else will worry about this weather, some new farmer with dreams of coffee fortunes, and they'll learn the same lessons you learned, or different ones, or maybe they'll learn nothing at all and just keep trying to bend the world until it breaks them. The valley will teach them whatever they're capable of learning, the way it taught you, the way it's taught everyone who ever tried to make this place give them more than it wanted to give. You reach the house and pause at the door, looking back one more time at the hills where you spent so many mornings watching the sky, and you realize you're going to miss this. Not the anxiety, not the struggle, not the constant calculation of risk and reward, but the simple act of paying attention, of being present in a world that never stops demanding your notice. The weather will go on without you, and the valley will go on without you, and eventually the coffee trees you planted will be replaced by something else, and then that something else will be replaced by something else again, and the sky will keep doing what it's always done, indifferent to all of it. You step inside, and the door closes behind you, and the morning continues outside as if you'd never been there at all.